Hello everybody, welcome to Mailbag number 4, week 5 of the climate change course. Not as exciting a presentation as the Apple release of the iPhone 6 that I watched a few hours ago, but hopefully with less technical hitches. I've got a few things to talk about. There's some technical stuff to go on and also some visual stuff to show you, and we're going to get straight into it with a click of the button. These are the main things we want to talk about this week. Science 101, we've got some questions coming in. This is great. Let's keep that going. Quizzes, the peer review assessment, which is coming to an end on Monday. The phase of that moving into the actual assessment of the first peer review assignment. And some picks and a very lovely story to finish. Let's get on with it. So Climate Science 101, we've got some requests coming in. What I'm liking here is that I'm hearing from people who feel a bit lost with the science. This isn't hard to do. This isn't presented at a popular level. This is presented at the level of first year university, or at least as far as a breadth subject is concerned, as we call them. And even that is going to lead to some questions, but that's absolutely fine because this is a learning experience and we expect and hope that you are going to have questions. We'll do our best to respond to those. We've done okay so far. We'd like to see the questions coming in. Please don't stop. We're into the second week of science. Enough time for people to get confused, enough time for people to start raising some issues about it. So keep that up, that's great. Getting a lot of technical questions. This is understandable. There's all sorts of ways that the Coursera platform can throw a loop, or throw you for a loop, throw a curveball, whatever the vernacular is. This isn't the way we want to go about it, but I think that this is normally the way that tech support works in some sense, at least on some level. We will try and get to everybody with the questions they have. That is not the case in all courses, I'm told, but it is the way that we want to do things here. We may not be able to answer all of your questions. We are just users of the platform as well, but Coursera does stand by to take on our questions as we need to. But Peter and Susan in the back room are doing great work supporting us, and between the lot of us, we should be able to come up with a solution to a problem if it's technically possible. Submissions. There's what the page looks like for your submission for your peer assessment. For your peer-reviewed assessment, sorry. Assessing will begin on Monday, our time, Monday evening. Submissions will close Monday evening, our time, with a 1-hour gap, I believe. You can see there the formats. This is written online, but I just want to highlight it. You can't submit a doc file, but you can submit a text file or a PDF file, or indeed you can copy and paste into that square your 750 words plus the 200 extra that we've allowed in case you really are finding that 750 isn't enough. This should work seamlessly, but we're already getting questions from people who are certainly finding problems. We will address those as well as we can, but remember, this closes on Monday at, I think, 5 p.m. Melbourne time. You can work out your relevant time zones to that. That's around midnight in California on Sunday night. So let us know, even if it is a bit late, there may be ways that we can allow that to count if there's a technical reason for this, but otherwise you do need to get it through on time. All right, so good luck with that. We're here to help. So on to our pitches for the week. A couple of new themes that we didn't quite touch on last week that I think are interesting, important, not necessarily happy at all. In fact, none of these really are. But we want to draw your attention to some of the visuals that accompany the descriptions of problems that probably may be arising from climate change. And I say that deliberately in this context because that is a political issue in itself. For example, here, in Colorado, in the USA, thank you Travis, we've got pictures of trees that were burnt out in 2002, but this picture was taken recently, 2014, 12 years later. Two things to say about this. One, this is a pine tree, or these are pine trees, or were pine trees. They went through a forest fire. Nothing new about that. What is proposed to be new, though, is that the effect of that forest fire was enhanced by an enhanced presence of the mountain pine beetle. Pine beetle infestation has become a major problem all along the Rockies in both Canada and the United States. And as I understand it, the argument goes something like this, that because it doesn't get quite as cold as it used to in the winter, the populations of the pine beetles don't quite diminish to the levels that they did. They therefore infest the pine trees at a greater rate and to a greater extent. And the result is a lot of dead trees that might not have otherwise died. This one from Kathy, who we saw her property last week suffering the effects of a more recent forest fire. This is also a tree that's on her property, I believe, succumbing to pine beetle infestation over a period of years and finally falling over in strong winds. The pine beetle contributes to the forest fire by creating more fuel for it by way of dead trees. And this is a feedback which gives rise to a more extreme event. Now that seems straightforward enough in the science, but in conversations in the States of America particularly, but also no doubt in Canada, it is very hard politically to admit, despite all of the evidence, that climate change plays a role in any of this process. This is a particular case in Colorado. There's material out there on the web that you may be interested in looking at. I posted a link in the relevant thread to this effect, where it's basically an ABC situation. There's a cause to all of this, to this new scenario, but it's anything but climate change. Have a look, see what you think. Here's a different sort of tree problem from Elena in Ukraine, where she is making reference in the discussion forum to the fact that this sort of tree, and there's a variety of them that she refers to, is undergoing a second blooming in September when autumn is supposed to be coming upon these trees because it's still too warm and the trees act as if it's May, more or less. The problem with that then is that it is obviously a very short blooming season, and in next to no time, despite this warmth, of course, no one says that it's not going to get cold, and it still does, frost comes upon these blooms very quickly and has a fairly devastating impact that it would not have otherwise done if it wasn't a little bit warmer. A problem around the world, another signal of climate change effects, quite possibly. You can investigate the science and see what people have to say about it. Thank you, Elena. Much closer to home for me, this was just a few kilometres down the road from this studio, in fact, in a Melbourne suburb known as Altona. We live by a bay down here that is periodically subject to storm surge, and it was definitely in this case just a few months ago, and Melita Fraser did take these photos at the time of that surge. You can see from the signs and the building that's just on right that the water has come inland quite significantly. And what's the important thing to bear in mind here is not so much the fact that storm surges happen, because they've always happened, as everyone is going to tell you, nothing new about storm surges, except that if the sea level is just that little bit higher, the storm surge is going to come inland just that little bit further. In fact, the proportion, while there's a discussion about it, is not 1-to-1, but there's something out there called Bruin's Law that David may or may not mention in the lectures, that in fact shows that inundation is considerable even if you have a few centimetres of sea level rise. So that's one picture. And this is another picture of that same storm surge in Altona. I put this up not only because it's a lovely stark picture, but also to recognise the idea that different parts of the world will have a different capacity to recover from an event like this. This sort of thing happens from time to time in Melbourne. Perhaps it's happening more frequently. But you'll notice that the sorts of buildings that are being inundated are much more capable of surviving the event and being repaired than buildings elsewhere in the world. We showed some examples of the flooding in Pakistan last week from Nazir Iqbal in his village in Punjab. And I think you'll notice quite readily the difference in strength, resilience, and size of these buildings. Yes, this will be an expensive repair for the people that own these buildings, but it will also be a repair that they're capable of making thanks to insurance or their own relative wealth compared to others in the world. So, interesting pictures. Thanks, Belita. We'll have some more storm surge pictures, no doubt, in coming weeks. But it's a part of the problem that doesn't just apply to certain areas of the world, but is very common. And in Australia, it definitely is. It's a major problem for local governments as to whose responsibility it is to deal with the effects of events like this. Now, something else that is often thrown up as evidence that climate change isn't happening is when you have increased snowfall, an extreme event, a more extreme event of cold. That is absolutely not the case as far as the modelling goes. Evidently, as I understand it, you are still going to get extreme cold events, not at the same rate as extreme warm events, but they will happen. Is this an example of something like this? Well, quite possibly. Many thanks to Zlatar in Zagreb in Croatia for showing us this picture of a snowstorm that occurred recently, taken from her balcony, where the local weather people characterised it as a storm that hadn't occurred on that level since about 1955. So the frequency of such events is also important here. So snowstorms are not incompatible with the idea of warming overall. It can be very cold, it can be very snowy. The overall temperatures can remain on the increase, however. So thanks to Zlatar for that, but there's also a very interesting story that she's also highlighted for us in the threads, and I invite you to go and have a look. So in addition to that snowstorm picture that Zlatar has sent us, we also have a very interesting story to tell, and Zlatar has related it to us. The observatory that has been taking meteorological readings in Zagreb opened in 1861. It's an astronomical observatory, I believe, as well as a meteorological one. Meteorological readings have been taken continuously since 1862 up until today. This graph takes us up to 2012. Observatory staff are very proud of the fact that this has been a continuous weather record. Now, this is one of many contributions to the IPCC reports. Many weather stations around the world have supplied data. Not all of them are continuous. This one is. Nothing special, perhaps you might think about that. In some countries of the world, it's been relatively easy to provide a continuous record, at least from a political and social point of view. In Australia, for example, we don't have major social upheavals that would get in the way of something like this. Fairly peaceful country all of that time before we became a country in 1901, and then continuously since then. We've moved weather stations around and whatnot, but by and large, a lot of those stations have provided continuous data. But it's worth thinking about the backstory to what's behind this fairly innocuous and fairly standard looking graph. In 2001, I believe this was a plaque that was placed on the side of the observatory in Zagreb after 140 years of weather measurement. It's worth understanding, at least briefly, the history of Croatia in order to appreciate just what an epic achievement it is to have got these continuous records. When this observatory was founded, it was in a region that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. For about the first 50 years of its existence, that was the case, despite all the political agitations, despite all the upheavals that were happening in society, particularly towards the end of that era. And then World War I occurred with obvious potential for disruption. And you may recall that World War I began with events in Sarajevo in Bosnia nearby, also part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but also involving Serbia, which was an independent state just near Croatia, and it is today again. Following World War I, Yugoslavia, or the first Yugoslavia, came into being. Again, political upheaval, lots of changes in attitudes of various sorts in society. And then World War II happened, and finally the Nazi invasion of 1941. The Nazis occupied Croatia, set up their own client state in Croatia. For 3 to 4 years, this was a battleground, as well as being an occupied territory. Out of that came Yugoslavia, the communist Yugoslavia of Tito up until 1980. And then the upheavals in the 1980s as Croatia sought to break away from what was the former Yugoslavia. And then the battles that ensued finally after independence being declared into 1995, when finally, with the accords of that year, Croatia has emerged as an independent modern state. All through that, meteorologists and other officials in that observatory have somehow managed to pull out a continuous record, to keep a continuous daily temperature record that is a crucial piece of the data that we look at and perhaps take for granted when considering the problems of climate change. So I would like you to consider some of the backstories that exist with a lot of the data that's been collected that allows us to make claims about global warming. Well, thanks for that. We look forward to catching up with you again next week. As I said, any problems that you've got, any technical problems, any other issues you'd like to raise, questions about the work, questions about the science, we're here to help. See you then.